Hello, everybody. This is Miss Peachy again from your WCA Biology B class. And here today we are looking at Unit 4, Lesson 14. Now, I found this to be an interesting unit. It did kind of go over some of the stuff that we have talked about previously, but it also introduced some new concepts in ecology and some kind of interesting scenarios and questions. So hopefully you guys will find this to be kind of an interesting unit or interesting lesson, I should say, as well. Our keywords in this lesson are biodiversity, ecosystem, homeostasis, intermediate disturbance hypothesis, and population. All right, so again, to remind you guys, below my video link, which is on my website, there is a link to this sheet here, which is just kind of a list of concepts that we went over in this lesson and some questions that might help you focus your note taking. All right, so it talks about how ecosystems can be impacted by disturbances, which is, again, something we have talked about in the past couple of units. Um, it does say how those disturbances can be kind of at a various levels. There are light disturbances, there are moderate disturbances, and there are kind of more impactful severe disturbances, right? And it says that that's different levels of severity, and they have an impact on lots of different things, including biodiversity within those ecosystems. Talks a bit about a light disturbance example. It could be something like a single tree falling over or a quick freeze of a pond during the fall. These are impacts that really are not going to have kind of a lasting impact on that ecosystems or disturbances. A couple of different organisms might be displaced from that or inconvenienced or something like that, but you're not going to find really a lasting effect. More of a moderate disturbance might be something like a severe storm that comes through an area, knocks down a whole bunch of trees, and therefore you've got a lot of different organisms that have to deal with the consequences of that particular storm. Maybe a disease that runs through an area that might be destroying some of the vegetation, maybe like a fire or something like that. Again, these aren't permanent disturbances. They're temporary, but they're more widespread and more, um, they're worse than light disturbances. For example, here a tropical storm came ashore, severely damaging the trees, and it asks you what kind of impact that might have on ecosystems. You got to think a little bit about how it affects the homeostasis or equilibrium of the ecosystem. That ecosystems have a kind of a balance, right? And when you are taking away habitat, when you're destroying food sources, um, you're going to be affecting the balance of that ecosystem. So some ways in which those types of disturbances can affect the ecosystem can be that food supplies are reduced, the amount of space to live is smaller, potential mates are gone, tree roots have been disrupted, so then you don't have, potentially this could cause increases in erosion, reduction of soil nutrients to plants, kind of goes on, and those are the types of impacts, both biotic and abiotic factors that are affected by moderate disturbances. And then on page 2, talks a bit about this intermediate disturbance hypothesis, which I think is very interesting. So basically, the premise of this hypothesis is that some sort of level of disturbance is necessary for the health of an ecosystem. Moderate disturbances, specifically, that healthy, very strong, very diverse ecosystems have regular moderate disturbances. That without them, that actually has, if you only had light disturbances, say, your ecosystem would actually be reduced in biodiversity. And I thought that was a very interesting premise and one that I had not actually heard of before. And then it goes on to explain how um, areas that only have low level disturbances tend to over specialize. You get species that are established that really don't have to deal with any kind of disturbances. So they're very specific about their food sources, and the only competition that exists is between species for food, for space, etc., right? And they don't have to have adaptations to environmental changes. Therefore, you're going to have very specific niches essentially that are established, and you're going to really not have a lot of fight for those biological niches, right? On contrasting, when you have moderate disturbances that occur regularly, there are going to be organisms that tolerate those disturbances better, um, and it opens up kind of other niches for organisms to fill. And remember, we haven't really talked about the term niche before. I've mentioned it on several occasions. I'm actually very surprised that they don't bring that term in. But essentially, it's kind of a place where a species fits within an ecosystem, depending upon like what type of requirements it needs, both abiotic and biotic factors, food source, space, sunlight, whatever it would happen to be, but no two species can occupy the same niche at the same time. Now, what's interesting is it goes on to talk a little bit about how, like an example of this that makes it make a little bit more sense. So every year you have this area that experiences flooding in the spring. And during the spring, when you have flooding that occurs in this area, some organisms don't tolerate those wet conditions very well. So they either die back, they go dormant, or they leave that area, right? And some organisms can tolerate that better. So it opens up those niches to the organisms that tolerate those wet conditions seasonally. And then when the conditions dry up, the ones that were there previous that tolerated the drier conditions move back into the area, and you've got more of a variety of organisms that are kind of living in the same area. So I thought that was kind of an interesting example to make us help us to better understand why the diversity would increase with those moderate disturbances. Areas that experience high level disturbances are at risk of total extinction. For example, a meteor impact would be a high level disturbance. These are very, very volatile situations which could result in the extinction of multiple species because the ecosystem changes so drastically and so abruptly. Um, and then we move on to kind of the last part of this, which is again an interesting topic as well. It talks about how, it talks a little bit about a trophic cascade. It really goes into a lot about trophic cascades and how trophic cascades are the result of, oftentimes the result of removing the top predator in an ecosystem. And it brings in some examples that I thought were very interesting as well. So essentially what happens is you remove the top predator, and that's going to affect all the different levels below the top predator. It's cascading effect, right? That has an effect on, you know, the anything that was the food source of the top predator, and then, then your maybe your secondary consumers and your primary consumers and even your producers can be affected by the removal of the top predator. It specifically talks about wolves and how wolves were kind of they were killed off back in the early 1900s because they posed a nuisance and oftentimes a danger to people who lived in the Great Plains and lived in kind of this area where they would have livestock that was killed by wolves, and that was an issue for a lot of farmers in the area. So they were targeted and they were killed. And by the 1940s, they were actually just completely gone. And now we're looking at Yellowstone National Park. I don't know if any of you have had the opportunity to go to Yellowstone. I was just able to go this past summer in 2021. Pretty awesome experience. Much, much bigger than I expected it to be, and just interesting to see the diversity of organisms within this protected area, right? What they found is that the population of elk just skyrocketed after they removed wolves from the ecosystem. The wolves ate the elk. So if you remove the predator, the prey is going to just obviously the number of prey going to go up a lot. They tried to take care of this problem by allowing hunters to kill some of the elk, and it helped somewhat. The number of elk did go down, but it rose back up again. Within 20 years, the herd was again at its historic high. And the problem is that um, there's not just the issue, you can't just, there's other things that happen when wolves are removed. Um, Coyotes became the dominant predator, right? Coyotes eat rodents and other small animals, which are the favorite of eagles, hawks, and foxes. So they're going to affect those organisms. Some organisms that may have been victim of wolves before, they go and they are able to destroy more of these aspen trees that are the favorite of beavers, and beavers populations suffer. So there's so many different facets to the destruction of the wolves. It's not just that the wolves ate certain things. You can't just say, well, let's target the elk and that takes care of it, because there's so many more organisms that were affected by wolves as well. And so what happened is they eventually had to reintroduce wolves into Yellowstone National Park. In 1995, wolves were reintroduced into Yellowstone National Park, and this excited scientists around the world. And so this is just one example here. It says, with wolves present again, the elk can no longer linger near the water where aspens grow because they're too vulnerable to the wolves, and therefore beavers get their trees back. And so that's just one kind of, success story of how it's very, very important to maintain a healthy ecosystem, that you do have a top predator. It goes on to talk a little bit about predator restoration and how this is an example of predator restoration because it helps to eliminate that trophic cascade. Hunting can be very beneficial to ecosystems when there aren't enough of the top predators available to maintain, to reduce the numbers of elk in this example, to make sure that they're maintaining a healthy population. We see this with white-tailed deer in Wisconsin as well, that hunting is necessary to keep the population of white-tailed deer at a manageable level. There are definitely rules about from that are involved in hunting as well. But hunting alone is not sufficient to maintain a healthy ecosystem and avoid the trophic cascade is pretty much the gist of what's going on in this part of the lesson. All right, everybody, that's it for me. That's it for lesson 14. If you have questions, you know to let me know. Otherwise, I will see you guys in the next lesson.